Hi, I'm Jim Warren. This is another segment in the series in which I've been exploring the concepts of René Girard and applying them to biblical peacemaking. I've been doing magic in this series, but in this case I'm not going to do a magic trick. What I'm going to do is more like a stunt. You might have seen it actually in a Chinese circus. There's no trick involved, but it does take a certain amount of know-how, and you have to acquire a certain knack to be able to do this. But it's a natural phenomenon, and I think that's appropriate because what I'm going to be describing to you is sort of a natural phenomenon among crowds, what we're going to be talking about. Anyway, I have a pitcher of rice here, and I'd like you to imagine the individual grains of rice as if they were human beings, individual human beings. If I pour them into the jar, we have kind of a free-for-all going on here. I mean, if you think of the grains of rice as being alive, you can kind of visualize this as kind of they're all competing with each other to reach the center of the jar, the bottom of the jar. They're tumbling one over the other. They're vying for the best positions inside the jar. It's kind of a state of random chaos, a state of anarchy, if you will. And human communities sometimes come dangerously close to this kind of situation. As a matter of fact, Jewish society at the time Jesus lived was in just this sort of disarray. You had so many groups that had competitions going on. They were rivals of each other. You had the Pharisees' rivalry with the Sadducees. You had the Essenes. You had lawyers and scribes. You had the Samaritans. I mean, the Samaritans even rejected the temple in Jerusalem. They went and built their own temple on a different hill. You had the people who were claiming to be messiahs. They were gathering groups of followers and proclaiming the end of the world. Some of them proclaimed the end of Roman domination because God was going to step in and deliver Israel. Then you had those guys who wanted to help God out a little bit here. God is a little bit too slow. They were impatient. So they wanted to take matters into their own hands. I mean, all these different groups disagreeing with each other about some of the most fundamental and basic beliefs and institutions of the culture. Jewish leaders were terrified that they wouldn't be able to control the populace. And that was a terrifying thought, because if they couldn't do it, Rome would. And I think that this kind of tension was at its height in the holy city of Jerusalem, and particularly during the sacred festival of Passover. That was the time when you had thousands of Jews from throughout the Roman Empire, and not a few pagans as well, flooding into the city of Jerusalem for the sacred festival. I'm going to pack this jar very full up to the brim there. In fact, let's pack it down. There you go. And I don't want to make a mess, so let's put the grains back inside. I don't want to lose any of them if possible. You see, you have a situation during the Passover when everybody has the opportunity to be right in everybody's face. That's when the tension was so thick, you could cut it with a knife, which I will do in a little bit. I'm surprised this jar hasn't exploded already in my own hands from all the pent-up rivalry, all the pent-up anger and jealousy. That's right, folks. They crammed themselves into Jerusalem. Let's get this all the way up to the brim. That's pretty good. So the question is, what is a community to do when it finds itself in this situation? Where you've got all this pent-up anger, resentment, jealousy, envy, rivalry. How can it discharge this violent energy in a way that will not threaten to destroy the community itself? That's the $64,000 question. And Girard has brilliantly answered it with his concept of the scapegoat mechanism. Enter the scapegoat. Now, this knife blade is very thin. In and of itself, it takes up very little volume. And if I push the knife blade down into the rice, you can see, I mean, its presence in there is very insignificant. It takes up very little volume. As a matter of fact, I didn't displace a single grain of rice when I pushed that blade in there. And yet, here's the amazing thing, folks. that blade will be perceived by the rice as an alien intruder. And that's all it takes for an agitated crowd to have an excuse to dump its violent energies on a victim. All it takes is for somebody bold enough to point their finger accusingly at someone, and the smallest, most insignificant, thin little excuse will do. Maybe it's just somebody who's visiting. They're an outsider. They're a foreigner, so they don't fit in. Maybe they have a physical deformity. Maybe they're a little bit, mentally, have some mental issues. Whatever it is, the color of skin, of course, all of these kinds of superficial things can become excuses to blame someone for the woes that the community happens to be suffering. If one person points the finger in accusation, there's a very good chance that somebody else will point their finger too. They will imitate this gesture. That's Girard talking about mimesis, imitation, how we imitate each other. And if two people are pointing the finger, it's very likely that a third will join in. And the more people that join in, the more powerful the attraction becomes to join the crowd and do what everybody else is doing, point the finger. And what happens is that all those fingers that used to be pointed at each other, Joe pointing at Frank, Mary pointing at Maria, all of those fingers, the crowd joins together and forms a unity, and they point one collective finger at the scapegoat. Well, that kind of realignment is so powerful that it can actually transform a chaotic and divided community into a single unified team. One thin blade of knife pushed down in there that didn't even displace a single grain, it's so insignificant in volume, becomes the occasion for these scattered random grains of rice to form a team that can actually support the entire heavy jar of rice. What an affirmation of group identity! Suddenly, these aren't just individual grains of rice. It's not just an aggregate. It has an identity, thanks to the polarization against the innocent victim. And look how powerful this bond is. I can even rock it back and forth. Well, there's one problem, though, with this kind of a bond. It may be powerful, but it's artificial. In the sense that it's not based on love of the neighbor, of one's neighbor. It's not even based on affection or mutual respect. It's a bond that exists purely at the expense of that scapegoat, of that victim. And so if that victim, once it's murdered or expelled or exported, once that's done, how long is it going to take before those rivalries start emerging again? How long is it going to take before the society starts falling apart again? How long will it take Frank to remember how much he hates Joe? How much will it take, Mary to remember how much she resents Maria? I don't know how long it'll take, a week, a month, a year, but I guarantee you this, it's going to happen. And when it does happen, people start looking around for another scapegoat. And that is why human communities are always on the lookout for scapegoats. We use them to reaffirm our own sense of identity. Caiaphas, who was the high priest during the time of Jesus, made the classic statement about scapegoating. He said, "It is better that one man die than that the whole nation should perish." And that really is the classic statement about scapegoating. It's what Girard calls sacrificial logic. It's the kind of logic that human communities have used from time immemorial. They've used it to solidify their own identity and bond over against an innocent victim. It's the kind of logic that lies behind ancient sacrificial rituals that were repeated over and over and over again, allowing the community to discharge its violent energy and reaffirm its distinctions and its bonds and its culture. And the modern variations of sacrificial ritual in which we still indulge. And it's the kind of logic that has enabled human communities to form and exist in a kind of a satanic, if you will, form of unity that really only mocks the real unity that Jesus was talking about. And I will end with just saying this, that sacrificial logic was luminously exposed for the first time in history in the New Testament Gospels, where we see Jesus revealed as the true scapegoat, who's crucified, and as a result of his crucifixion, brings together Pilate and Herod, brings together Sadducee and Pharisee, brings together Gentile Roman soldier and Jewish citizen, brings everybody together in a crowd pointing the finger. But this time, the devil overplayed his hand, and the scapegoat mechanism was revealed for all of us to see.